Well, hey everybody, I am finally done almost completely with grad school. I just have a few more things to do and I get to graduate, and I'm almost done. But I'm done with my paper and I've done my presentation on it. It feels so wonderful to be done. But last month was really crazy. As you noticed, it is now May, and this is being uploaded kind of the first week of May. And I had a lot of movies to watch. There was about 26 to watch, but I only watched probably about 20 of them, because some of them I've seen before. But I wanted to gear up for this 1929 all the way to 1939 and pick my best movie of each of these years. And so I was really excited to tackle this. I didn't realize how daunting this could be, especially for a lot of the things that I have not seen. So it's going to be really hard to pick a lot of these movies. So let's actually just get into this. So this is my movie series. This is my second part. Hopefully, if you checked out the one before, where I went from 1918 to 1928, you've noticed that I went my first 10 years of movie history. So now we're going to go from 1929 to 1939. So I'm going to go through each year, and I'm going to tell you which is my favorite movie of that year and why, and explain a little bit about other choices that I could have fought up against. So let's go with my 1929 pick. What could it be? Yeah, let's see. What is my 1929 pick? Oh, it's the Marx Brothers. That's something I picked. My 1929 pick is actually in this Marx Brothers collection. It is actually called The Coconuts. And that is my first introduction to the Marx Brothers. We have Chico, we have Groucho, we have Harpo, and we even have Zeppo. These Marx Brothers, I actually have never watched anything of these guys. I've had this collection for quite some time, but I really haven't explored any of their films. And good God, this stuff is hilarious. I love Groucho so much, and Chico, they're probably the funniest, on top of Harpo just being really hilarious in a physical comedy sense. But Zeppo is really good too, as well. He's kind of the glue that kind of holds them together. He's there, but he doesn't really have to be there as well. But I really loved all these films. I even watched Animal Crackers, I watched Horse Feathers, Monkey Business, and even Duck Soup. And Duck Soup might be one of my favorite movies of all time, so it was really funny. But The Coconuts, this is my 1929 pick because I really didn't see any other movies in 1929. And I really loved the way this was. This was my first introduction to them, and I really loved how slapstick this was and how over the top. In fact, I actually want to read some of the lines from this movie. It's going to be really bad and really bad scripted. So let me read this to you. So 3 years ago I came to Florida without a nickel in my pocket. And now I have a nickel in my pocket. And that's something that Groucho Marx would say. This is just this silly, over-the-top kind of thing going on with this movie. And the plot is kind of ridiculous and random. Groucho Marx is actually the principal main character of this movie. He's the hotel manager of the Hotel de Coconuts, which is just this hilarious, I want to say Caribbean resort. It's really silly. And then the brothers come. Zeppo is one of the guests there. Harpo and Chico are kind of just this pair. They've always been a pair in these movies, and it's just really silly and really funny. I really like The Coconuts, and it was a great introduction to the Marx Brothers, and I highly recommend checking out The Coconuts, because I would definitely watch all these movies again. So that was my 1929 pick, was The Coconuts. I really loved it, and I love the Marx Brothers now. I can't wait to watch more films with them in it, but this is great stuff. I love the Marx Brothers. Alright, moving on from 1929 to 1930, and no, it's actually not the second movie that the Marx Brothers did. It's actually an anti-war film called All Quiet on the Western Front. Now this is actually one of the last movies that I saw on my entire 1930s kind of list that I wanted to see. It's one of the longest ones, but it's also one of the most daunting ones, because I knew I was going to go into this thing being a little bit like, okay, this is one that might be a little bit tougher on my psyche. Not as funny as the Marx Brothers, or kind of slapstick and silly that we'll see, and kind of just in a horror genre. We'll get to that as well. But not as, I didn't realize how impactful this movie would be. So this movie was directed by Louis Milestone, and this movie is one of the, I guess, greatest one of the anti-war movies of all time. The shock and horror in this movie is really seen in a psychological sense on all the characters in this movie. And you can see through this company that follows them around, and this is about World War I, obviously. This World War II has not happened yet during this time period, and this is right at the crux. The Great Depression just started, 1929 hit, and that was just a bad time just in general. But 1930, we saw All Quiet on the Western Front talking about anti-war as nationalism and war was actually on the rise in Europe, especially during this time before World War II. But this movie was really good, probably on the U.S. psyche, to not enter this war, because this was a crazy psychological toll. You can see within each of the characters how deep and scary this trench warfare was, and especially on the two main characters that we follow. One of them even loses their legs, and that's what's so insane about this movie. And it does not end on a happy note. The movie ends on a very kind of sad note, but also just a reminder of what beauty is in this world. And I don't really want to give it away because I think it's something you should probably watch yourself. So I definitely highly recommend All Quiet on the Western Front. It kind of takes a little bit to get going because, you know, it's kind of built around this kind of drama, but it really gets it as you sit there and just keep watching what's going on and what happens to the psyche of all the characters in this movie. This movie is also funny. It's got some funny parts to it too. It humanizes a lot of things. So I definitely highly recommend checking out All Quiet on the Western Front. This is my pick for 1930. So let's actually move to 1931, which was one of the most difficult years to pick a movie from. In fact, I actually have some right here. Should I have picked Frankenstein? I don't know. That was a really great film. It's probably one of my favorite Universal horror monster films. Could I have picked Dracula? Another one that was really, really good as well. Or should I even have picked La Chienne, which is translated to The Bitch by Jean Renoir? I actually watched this movie and really, really loved it. It's a crazy psychological, tormented movie here. Or should I have actually picked City Lights? We have another Charlie Chaplin film that we talked about last time, a couple times before with The Kid and also The Gold Rush. We have another tramp movie. It's actually none of these movies. It's actually the movie called M. This is directed by Fritz Lang, and when we last saw the director, we actually saw Metropolis, and that movie was an amazing, astronomical feat. So now we're actually in a darker realm than Metropolis. That one's a little bit more on the widespread scene. This is more of a character drama where we're seeing a very specific thing. We're seeing this psychological thriller, and this is a German film, and we have Peter Lorre right here. And you can see that iconic shot where he's looking at himself in the window. He is pretty much on the run. We see the opening shot of this movie. The first two shots are just insane. The first shot is of these kids playing just jump rope and just singing along, kind of just in a Ring Around the Rosie kind of sense. But they're singing this song that's about a murderer that's going around in Berlin taking little children, and it's just it kind of sets the entire tone for the entire film. And that's what's so sinister about this movie. In the second scene, like I'm saying at the very beginning, was we see this little girl, and I want to read the back of this. What's her name? Elsie Beckman. And you see her kind of just reading this sign, and then you see this shadow come on, and you actually you notice it's actually Peter Lorre's character, who is Hans Beckert. And you kind of automatically know there's something not right about this. And you read the sign, and it literally tells you what this killer does, and he does it right there. And you kind of know who it is at the very beginning. You kind of know he's the killer. And so in this social commentary of early Germany before World War II, you can see the distrust and kind of the cross between vigilante justice versus justice done by the police, and trying to find this killer who is just destroying all these kids and all these families. And this movie, I just recently saw this, so I really probably can't go too in depth with it, but this movie really drew me in when I first watched it, and it's something you can't put away, especially near the beginning and the middle parts, and even the end are just so enticing with this tribunal of vigilante justice that is going on against Peter Lorre's character, which is just in a very dark and very suspenseful kind of way. This is kind of this psychological thriller that you can see the camera work and everything come together in the end, working to be a very beautiful film, and also just kind of the prototype for a lot of the movies that we've seen in the future. So I highly recommend checking out Fritz Lang's M. This movie is very good and very dark, and I actually highly recommend checking out all these movies I just talked about from 1931, because that was a really good year. We're actually going to get to another year where it's actually really difficult later on in this list. So let's actually go on to 1932, to a film all about horror, and that is Vampeer. This is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampeer, and we actually saw Carl last time when we talked about The Passion of Joan of Arc. and this is another German film. He's a Danish director, but in this film, I watched this actually a few months back for the first time, and I didn't realize what was going on, but it was a very dreamlike thing that really was horrific in its execution. And you can see alone with a scythe how daunting and terrifying this thing is. It's almost like it's pestilence. That's what vampiric things are, kind of, in this way that you can see in this town that is being terrorized by possibly this monster that's attacking them. And that's what's so interesting and kind of dreamlike about this movie, especially how the camera work is done, and the practical and special effects are just insane for the time, and honestly just draws you in. You're like, how did they do that? How did they do this stuff? This movie is very atmospheric and austere in its presentation. I really love this movie. I want to watch it again because I don't actually think I can give it justice talking about it right now. But this movie came across some other competition from 1932 that I actually really liked as well, and that is Isle of the Lost Souls and also The Mummy. So we also have a Universal Horror Monster Classic and Isle of the Lost Souls, which also has Bela Lugosi in it, based on H.G. Wells. These movies were really good and a contender, and it's actually ironic because all these movies are kind of horror in a sense. And so it was hard to pick Vampeer, but I think for its overall practical effects, its overall dreamlike atmosphere, and just this weird psychological trip, I really loved it and appreciated it for what it is, and I can't wait to watch it again. So let's move on to 1933, to a movie that I really love. So in 1933, we actually have another Universal Horror Monster movie, and that is The Invisible Man. This is directed by James Whale, which we'll actually talk about him in a second a little bit more. And this is one of my favorite Universal Horror Monster movies, because this is a movie that literally grabbed my attention and just kept to it. So it's starring this scientist who was actually played by, and I'm going to just look it up, Claude Rains. I should have known that, Claude Rains. And he develops a serum that turns him invisible. But simultaneously, as he's trying to kind of go about this discovery and try to be quiet about it, the serum also drives him a little mad, and it drives him insane and crazy, and so he starts doing these horrific things from rape and murder and just all these things that are just horrific and just terrifying. And for its time, the special effects were really well done as well, and the makeup is actually by John P. Fulton, and apparently these techniques are still used today, and that's something that I never really thought about, how well all these special effects were, these practical effects that they've done with the camera work, and just how well executed this entire film was, and how enticing the entire story was. I really loved Invisible Man. I want to watch it again. I actually haven't seen this since last year, but I would highly recommend checking out The Invisible Man. This movie actually came up across some other competition, and that is from the musical, the 42nd Street, and I like this movie, but musicals aren't my thing, but I watched this nonetheless because I really was curious, and that was one of the movies that popped up, and I really liked it as well, and I would like to talk about this movie a little bit more later on in the future, possibly, but I would highly recommend checking out 42nd Street and The Invisible Man, but Invisible Man was my pick. So let's move on from 1933 to 1934. So in 1934, we actually get introduced to the man, the myth, the legend, Alfred Hitchcock, and the man who knew too much. And this is the first one, not the one from 1956 with Jimmy Stewart. This is actually the first time he did this movie. They're both directed by Hitchcock. And this movie, actually, you can see Peter Lorre right there. You've seen that face before. You saw it in an M when we were talking about Fritz Lang. But this is the first movie that actually Peter Lorre was in an English film, because he's, German, and so this is the first time. This is a British kind of espionage spy thriller going on, where this couple is in Switzerland, and they get thrust in this political kind of drama with Peter Lorre being the villain, and he actually plays a very memorable villain. You just look at that haircut and the way you can see that scar on his face. He's a formidable looking person, and he's also just a strange looking cat to begin with. This movie is definitely Hitchcockian because it is tense and suspenseful, but also has some humorous dialogue, and that's something that this is one of the latter Hitchcock films that I've seen, even though this is one of his earliest films, and I didn't realize how funny Hitchcock was with his dialogue, and also just how suspenseful it is at the same time. I mean, I've watched a lot of the Hitchcock films lately, and I've realized that this is kind of the prototype for the movies that would further come along. And so I really loved The Man Who Knew Too Much. I thought this had an explosive ending. I really loved the ending of this movie. And this crazy thing that I'm not going to spoil because I want you to see it. Hitchcock movies, you don't spoil them, you just watch it and kind of just see how the journey takes you. So this is the movie from 1934 that I really, really liked, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And this is the 1934 version, not the 1956 version. So let's actually move on to 1935 to another film by Alfred Hitchcock, possibly. But it's actually not. It's not the 39 Steps. As much as I like the 39 Steps, it's actually The Bride of Frankenstein. I actually liked it a little bit more. The only reason I say that is because the 39 Steps is something I just recently saw, and I haven't had enough time to digest. But we'll talk about this movie all about the Scottish Moors and this mystery that's going on. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I want to talk a little bit about The Bride of Frankenstein, which is my 1935 pick. And my 1935 pick is another Universal horror monster movie, but guess what? This time it's kind of a comic, a mix between a drama, a horror, and a comic film. It's really hilarious and kind of just really insane and zany. And that's something it's hard to describe. I haven't seen this movie in a couple of years, but I really loved it, and it's very memorable in the sense that this Frankenstein's monster, who is played, obviously, by Boris Karloff, and now we have Elsa Lanchester as the Bride of Frankenstein. I should know better. Poor me. There's so many names, and also my mind is just everywhere because of the master's degree. Thanks. But anyways, let's go back to Bride of Frankenstein. So we have Frankenstein. It literally picks off right after the events of Frankenstein, and we have this new doctor, Dr. Pistorius, who is trying to get a companion for Frankenstein, and so that's where we get the creation of the Bride of Frankenstein and this kind of zany, comic, dark, twisted drama. I don't know how to describe it. I need to really rewatch it again, but I really loved this movie because it was a different take on the Universal horror monster movie, and it's very memorable in its approach, and it's definitely its genre. And so I definitely highly recommend this movie. I actually like this movie a little bit less than Frankenstein, but I really love The Bride of Frankenstein. So I would highly recommend checking out Bride of Frankenstein. This movie's hilarious and dark at the same time. And also check out 39 Steps because that's a really great Hitchcock film. So let's actually move on to 1936 to a film where we see the tramp one last time in modern times. This is Charlie Chaplin's social commentary on the working class. And you can see him in the 40s kind of going against the grain of the United States, where he kind of embraces socialism and communism a little bit later. But you can kind of see the workings of that going on in this movie as we see the proletariat fighting off the bourgeoisie, of course. And so with this movie, you see the tramp going on from job to job. It starts off with a factory. He eventually gets a job at a department store working as like pretty much a night side security guy. But he also just runs into this girl that he just falls in love with. She's also homeless. Actually, the word I've never heard actually is gorgeous gamine. And that girl is Paulette Goddard. And he actually marries her in real life later on. But I guess I looked into it after this, and Charlie Chaplin has a checkered past with a lot of women. I didn't know that. But this movie was hilarious. I really loved all the bits. I don't think I like it as much as Gold Rush. It doesn't have as much memorable things to it, but it also has just a lot of really crazy and zany physical comedy that you just know Charlie Chaplin to do. And this is the middle of the talk era. This is where talkies kind of just started becoming a thing. And that's what he did. He stuck to his guns and kept going silent with it. That was what was weird about this movie, and how he just didn't do that. The weird thing about modern times is actually there is some talking in this movie, and it's usually done by either the radio or song, or some of the characters have dialogue. It's really strange. It's this weird combination. It really threw me off the first time I was watching it near the beginning. I was like, wait a minute. It's a silent movie with, cards with the dialogue, and then there's talking sometimes. And it's all over the place, but I really loved Modern Times, and I would highly recommend checking this movie out. This movie actually has some parallels to just anything in the 1800s, 1900s, and even 2000s of what's going on with the modern worker, and has some decent commentary on that. And so I would definitely highly recommend checking out Modern Times. Charlie Chaplin, last time as the Tramp, hilarious movie, and also at the same time has a little bit to it. So let's actually go to 1937, where I actually had several picks to choose from, but I went with my first animated picture on this list, and that is the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is Disney's classic movie. I didn't realize how old this was. I remember growing up and thinking it was maybe from the 50s or 60s, but no, 30s. That's insane. I remember growing up with this movie. It's one of my first VHSs that I ever owned, and I really loved it, and maybe not as much as some of the 90s movies, and also we'll talk about some other Disney movies as we progress into this list. But Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is this very classic Grimm's fairy tale, obviously in a lighter Disney tone, because Grimm fairy tales are a lot darker, telling the story of Snow White, and then she runs into the Seven Dwarfs. We also have the Queen, who's very vain. You have the mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the loveliest of them all, obviously, and we have the Seven Dwarfs, who I cannot remember all their names, so let me look. Alright, we got Doc, we got Grumpy, we got Dopey, we got Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, and Sneezy. Those are all the Seven Dwarfs, and I'm not going to probably remember all of them. I could probably list 5 or 6, but doesn't matter. But those Seven Dwarfs pretty much get to meet Snow White as she's going through the woods. She's lost, and more or less you see the story unfold. If you haven't seen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I mean, come on. Have you not seen this? You know, she falls asleep after she eats the apple, has to be kissed by Prince Charming. That's kind of how this movie ends in this nice fairy tale movie. But this movie is very comical, very groundbreaking in animation-wise. Disney kind of just set their formula here with this movie. It's really well done. I actually even like the Blu-ray edition of this, even though you can see some of the flaws. I think that this Blu-ray edition really gives you a little bit more purpose as they try to revive this movie itself. So I highly recommend checking out Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs if you haven't even known this movie. This movie is really great, and so, yeah. Let's move on to 1938. Alright, so 1938 was another movie by Alfred Hitchcock in his British days, and that is The Lady Vanishes. And this movie is kind of just a silly thriller, just like, you know, Hitchcock already does. So we have this English tourist who is going on this train throughout Europe in this fictional town, kind of, and she meets this lovely old lady, and her name is Dame May Whitty, and she's this charming old lady, and they meet several people on the train, and then they kind of go to this cart. The main character falls asleep, and then she wakes up and realizes that this person may have not existed, or she vanished somehow. And she asks the people in the cart, like, did you see this girl? Like, what girl? Like, what lady? What old lady are you talking about? We don't know who this person is. And so that's where the mystery kind of just starts unfolding there. As she meets other passengers who have never seen her before, and there's one guy who's skeptical about it too. He's like, I kind of remember this person. Let's try to figure out this entire thing. It's hilarious with the dialogue. It's very British, and it's also at the same time very charming and also suspenseful, and I really loved it, and the ending is also kind of crazy as well. Some of it's kind of predictable, but it's a very fun train ride, and it's a film that I would highly recommend for anyone who loves Alfred Hitchcock or anyone checking out any of his early works. This is a movie to go. So let's actually move on to the second year on this list that is one of the most difficult to pin what is the best movie from this year. Alright, 1939. What is it? Is it Stagecoach, John Ford? It's not. Is it The Rules of the Game, Jean Renoir? I wish it was, but I've only seen this once, and it was really fun, and I want to talk about this movie a little bit later. Or is it Gone with the Wind? It's not Gone with the Wind. You would think it might be, but it's actually The Wizard of Oz. This movie, directed by Victor Fleming, is one of the films, just like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that was from my childhood, and I've seen quite a lot. Probably 100 times. I don't know how many times I've seen this movie. But this movie has stuck with me for so long. It's one of the first movies that I think I saw that reminded me like what Technicolor was. I didn't know what that was at the time when I was younger. And so Wizard of Oz is this very colorful and bright picture about this girl named Dorothy who's from Kansas, and her dog Toto, who gets sucked up in a tornado, because this is during the Great Depression. They get sucked up into this mystical land of Oz, and she runs into a scarecrow, a lion, and a Tin Man, all to defeat the Wicked Witch of the West and trying to get home. That's all she's trying to do. And she even meets several people on the way, from the Lollipop Guild to flying monkeys to all these things in this movie. The Wizard of Oz, if you haven't seen this movie, come on. I mean, this is one of the most classic films of all time. This movie is a great kind of moral tale about just trying to find courage, try to find heart, and also just to try to find you know, intelligence as well. And this just during this very hard time in the world, because remember, like I said earlier, this is during the Great Depression and leading up to World War II. This is a very dark time in history, and so cinema reflects some of that, as we can see some of the social commentary on some of the works from modern time where Lady vanishes. We can even see this escapism in The Wizard of Oz, as World War II is on the rise, and the very beginning of World War II is happening around 1939, even though it's like 1938, you know. So The Wizard of Oz is America's way of kind of trying to get over the Depression and kind of understanding what's going on in the time period. And this was a very great year for films, and especially I just, you know, I glanced over Rules of the Game, I glanced over Gone with the Wind. These are classic films. These are movies that are really high on my list and really worth your time. And so that I even set my own rules. Remember, I told you, I'm picking one movie for each year. And this movie happens to be The Wizard of Oz because it's kept with me for so long, and it brings me immense joy when I watch it, and I really like escaping to this land. So those are my picks from 1929 to 1939, during a very difficult time in history, but a really great time for film history. I'm really looking forward to the next section of this, which is 1940 to 1950. I can already think of some of them. I have to watch a lot. I'm really looking forward to this. I cannot wait to check out more films. I want to hear your thoughts down below on my picks. I want to hear your thoughts on what you think of my 1928 pick, 1934 pick, 1939 pick, you name it. I want to hear your thoughts down below on what your favorite picks are. Some movies I definitely should check out or definitely look into. And I want to hear your thoughts down below on just how this entire venture is going for you. Thank you so much for your time. Give this video a like. Don't forget to share this video and also subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I'm not jonesing around.